If the denominator of a fraction has both an integer and a radical, then multiplying the numerator and the denominator by the radical will not eliminate the radical from the fraction. So in our previous section, since we had the square root of 3 in the denominator, we would multiply the numerator and the denominator by the square root of 3, and that would get rid of this radical. But if we do that here, 1 times the square root of 3 gives us the square root of 3 in the numerator. But in the denominator, you have to distribute this to each of these terms. So the square root of 3 times 2 gives you 2 times the square root of 3. The square root of 3 times the square root of 3 gives you 3. So by multiplying the numerator and the denominator by this radical, the square root of 3, that does not help us rationalize the denominator. So that leads us to the conjugate. The conjugate of a binomial is the result of switching the sign between the two terms without changing the order of the terms. So in this example, we have 2 and radical 3, and between them we have addition or plus. We switch this to subtraction instead, and this now 2 minus the square root of 3 is the conjugate of this term. You do not change the integer or the radical, you just change the sign between them. If this term were negative, same thing, you leave the negative sign, but you change this one, the one between them, from negative to positive. So the one in front stays, the one between them changes. Now, why is this important? If a binomial is multiplied by the conjugate, then the radical sign will be removed. So this is how we're going to remove the radical sign from the denominator of a fraction. But first, let's just look at what happens when we multiply two conjugates. We're looking for the radical sign to be removed. So let's say you're multiplying negative 4 minus radical 5. Multiplying it times the conjugate, we just change the sign to positive. Negative 4 times negative 4, we're using the FOIL method, gives you 16. Negative 4 times positive radical 5 gives you negative 4 times 1, which is negative 4 radical 5. Then the inside terms, negative radical 5 times negative 4. Negative 4 times negative 1 is positive 4 as the coefficient, times radical 5. Negative 4 radical 5 and positive 4 radical 5 cancel each other out. Negative 4 plus 4 would give you 0 radical 5. 0 times radical 5 is 0. So we remove those. And then you multiply your last terms. Negative radical 5 times positive radical 5. The square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is 5. Negative 1 times positive 1 is negative 1. So we get negative 1 times 5, which is negative 5. 16 minus 5 is 11. So by multiplying this binomial times its conjugate, we wind up with a whole number. Now, before we take a look at an example, let's also discuss simplifying fractions, which we looked at briefly in the last example of our previous section. If a fraction has multiple terms in the numerator and or the denominator, then it can only be simplified if all of the terms have a common factor. So let's say you have 4 plus 8 times the square root of 5 over 6. This can be simplified because this 4, the coefficient 8, and the term in the denominator 6 can all be divided by 2. So 4 divided by 2 gives you 2. 8 divided by 2 gives you 4. And 6 divided by 2 would give you 3. So simplifying this fraction would give you 2 plus 4 radical 5 over 3. Simplifying the fraction, you are removing the common factor from the coefficient of the radical term, not the radical term itself. So that 2 comes from the coefficient. In this example, if you had 5 plus 8 radical 5 over 6, although 6 and 8 are both divisible by 2, this fraction cannot be simplified further since the 2 cannot be removed from the 5 as well. Okay, so since there's no common factor between the 5, 8, and 6, we cannot simplify it any further. Now in this example, we have two terms in the denominator, so we'll need to make sure that both the integers and both the coefficients are all divisible by the same number in order to simplify this fraction. And in this case, we can divide each one by 5. 5 divided by 5 is equal to 1. 10 divided by 5 is equal to 2. 15 divided by 5 is equal to 3. And 20 divided by 5 is equal to 4. So when we simplify this fraction, you get 1 plus 2 radical 5 divided by 3 minus 4 radical 6. But if you had 5 plus 10 radical 5 divided by 14 minus 20 radical 6, although these three can each be divided by 5, 14 does not have a common factor with 5, 10, and 20. So because of that, you cannot simplify this one at all. All right, so keep this in mind when you are simplifying your answers. Let's take a look at a question. Rationalize and simplify 5 divided by 2 minus the square root of 6. We have a binomial in the denominator, so we want to multiply the numerator and the denominator by the conjugate of this denominator. The conjugate, you change the sign between them. So the conjugate would be 2 plus the square root of 6. So we multiply 5 over 2 minus the square root of 6 by 2 plus the square root of 6 divided by 2 plus the square root of 6. Anything divided by itself is equal to 1. Anything times 1 is itself. So by multiplying this fraction by this fraction, you are not changing the actual value of this fraction. You are just changing how you represent it. Step 1, multiply the numerator, 5, by the conjugate of the denominator. The conjugate would be 2 plus the square root of 6. 5 times 2 gives you 10. 5 times the square root of 6 gives us 5 radical 6. And now we multiply the denominator by the conjugate of the denominator. 2 times 2 gives you 4. 2 times positive radical 6 is positive 2 radical 6. Negative radical 6 times 2 gives you negative 2 radical 6. Positive 2 and negative 2 cancel each other out. And negative radical 6 times positive radical 6 gives you negative 6. 4 minus 6 is equal to negative 2. And since this coefficient, this number, and this number do not have a common factor, we can leave the answer like this. 10 plus 5 radical 6 divided by negative 2. So that is how we go about rationalizing with the conjugate. Let's wrap things up by having you complete a few practice questions. Rationalize and simplify. Question number 1, 6 divided by the square root of 8 plus 3. Question number 2, 3 divided by 4 minus 3 times the square root of 3. And question number 3, 4 minus radical 5 divided by negative 2 plus radical 5. Pause the video, answer these questions, and then press play when you are ready to begin. Question number 1. You want to rationalize 6 divided by the square root of 8 plus 3. So step 1, multiply the numerator 6 by the conjugate of the denominator. The conjugate is the result of switching this plus to a minus. So the conjugate is radical 8 minus 3. So when we multiply the numerator by radical 8 minus 3, we get 6 times radical 8, which is 6 radical 8. And we get 6 times negative 3, which is negative 18. Step 2, multiply the denominator by the conjugate of the denominator, radical 8 minus 3. When we do so, we're going to use the FOIL method since we're multiplying a binomial times a binomial. So this term is multiplied times both of these terms, and the 3 is multiplied by both of these terms as well. Radical 8 times radical 8 is equal to 8. Radical 8 times negative 3 is negative 3 radical 8. Positive 3 times radical 8 is positive 3 radical 8. Negative 3 and positive 3 radical 8 negate each other, so we can remove those. Positive 3 times negative 3 is negative 9, leaving us with 8 minus 9 in the denominator, which is equal to negative 1. This coefficient, this number, negative 18, and the number in the denominator, negative 1, can all be simplified by dividing them by negative 1. When we do so, 6 divided by negative 1 is negative 6. Negative 18 divided by negative 1 is positive 18. Negative 1 divided by negative 1 is positive 1. So anything divided by 1 is just itself. Thus, this is removed, leaving us with negative 6 radical 8 plus 18. Question number 2. You were given 3 divided by 4 minus 3 radical 3. Step 1, multiply the numerator, 3, by the conjugate of the denominator. When we switch minus to plus, the conjugate becomes 4 plus 3 radical 3. So step 1, we multiply the 3 times the conjugate. We get 3 times 4, which is 12. 3 times positive 3 is positive 9, radical 3. And now step 2, multiply the denominator by the conjugate of the denominator. When we do so, we get 4 times 4, which is 16. 4 times positive 3 is positive 12, radical 3. Negative 3 times 4 gives you negative 12, radical 3. Positive 12 radical 3 and negative 12 radical 3 negate each other, so we can remove them. And then we have negative 3 times positive 3, which is negative 9, times the square root of 3 times the square root of 3, which is 3. Negative 9 times 3 is negative 27. 16 minus 27 is negative 11. So since 12, 9, and 11 do not have a common factor, the final answer is 12 plus 9 radical 3 divided by negative 11. And then question number 3, we have a binomial in the numerator and we have a binomial in the denominator. To rationalize, we multiply the numerator and the denominator by the conjugate of the denominator. The conjugate of the denominator is the result of changing the plus sign to the negative sign. Leave the negative in front of the 2. So step 1, multiply the numerator by the conjugate of the denominator. This requires us to use the FOIL method. So we take this term and multiply it times each of these. And then we'll take this term and multiply it times each of these. And repeat that in the denominator. So first, 4 times negative 2 will give you negative 8. 4 times negative 1 gives you negative 4, radical 5. negative 1 times negative 2 is positive 2 as your coefficient, times radical 5. Negative 4 radical 5 plus 2 radical 5 would give you negative 2 radical 5. And then negative radical 5 times negative radical 5. Negative times negative is positive. The square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is 5. Negative 8 plus 5 is negative 3. So after step 1, we have negative 3 minus 2 radical 5 in the numerator. And now the denominator, we get negative 2 times negative 2, which is positive 4. Negative 2 times negative 1 gives us positive 2 times radical 5. Positive 1 times negative 2 gives you negative 2 radical 5. Positive 2 and negative 2 negate each other. And then the square root of 5 times negative square root of 5 is equal to negative 5. So now we have 4 minus 5 in the denominator, which gives us negative 1. And we can simplify the fraction by dividing negative 3 by negative 1, negative 2 by negative 1, and negative 1 by negative 1. Negative 1 is our common factor. When we do so, negative 3 divided by negative 1 is positive 3. Negative 2 divided by negative 1 is positive 2. Negative 1 divided by negative 1 is just 1. So we can remove the denominator, leaving us with a final answer of 3 plus 2 radical 5.